Hello, passionate anime aficionados. The spring anime season is nearly at a close. So let's talk about Megalobox, which I've just finished. The unique boxing anime that was supposed to have this hook where the boxers fight not just with their fists, but these mechanical boxing peripherals called gear, which, seemed like a really cool idea that you think the show would have taken really far. You think that would have been sort of, what separates it from something like Hajime no Ippo. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I went into this one with a lot of hope. It started off really well as far as style and presentation. I liked the idea of kind of going for this retro, kind of early 2000s, kind of Samurai Champloo vibe. It had those soft edges and that kind of greenier, sort of more hand drawn aesthetic. It had the cool music, the cool intro with the protagonist on his motorcycle, and it's got this underdog story going on, and it really, really wants you to know that it's an underdog story. God damn. I can't remember the last underdog story that underdogged harder than this underdog story does. And we'll get to that. Unfortunately, the most unique hook that this show had going for it, the whole gear thing, doesn't get taken very far. And that is actually one of the biggest disappointments for me, because you could have done so much with that, really. It's kind of something to freshen up the whole boxing genre or whatever. And, it's set in this kind of semi-sci-fi future. So you kind of go into it thinking that the gears are going to be kind of the main draw of the show. You think Joe is going to have to take on each opponent with their own unique gear and their own unique weaknesses and attributes, and you think that's going to be like, the big draw. And really, what's bizarre about this show is that it spends most of its duration pushing gear aside. It's almost like a bad thing in the story. It's like something that, rather than being really kind of mined for its potential, it's more like the show is constantly telling you, like, no, Joe is gearless. He doesn't use gear. He's such an underdog that he doesn't even use the gear. He fights the boxers without the gear. And at first I was like, okay, that's fine. I see how that would play into the underdog thing. But then, even the opponents using their gear, there's not much to think about or wrap your head around, because the gear is usually just a visual attraction. They look cool, but they don't usually present much into the plot. There are only a few instances where the gear really seems to play a role. It's not to say it's absent from the story. They certainly talk about it a hell of a lot, but it always feels like it's kind of pushed aside. The one example of a time where Joe even needs to consider the gear of the opponents he's fighting isn't even in the ring. It's when he's protecting the kids outside the gear store or whatever in episode 3 or 2, I don't remember, but he's fighting some big guy, and he's got this big, huge gear on him that's got like engines revving on the back, and there's one instance of like strategy that's supposed to be applied to this battle so that he can beat the guy with the gear. And what's funny is I think he's still wearing gear at that point in the show, so this is before he's even abandoned it, I'm pretty sure. And personally, I would have liked to have seen this anime really push the gear thing a lot harder. Why not have Joe wear gear? Why not see how, he has to utilize the gear he has against other opponents' gear? It's like you introduce this really cool concept that looks cool, Why not apply more rules to it, make it more interesting, make it more strategic? Then you've got what could be a cool boxing anime that also has something that, say, Hajime no Ippo doesn't have. But no, instead it tries to be, it ends up just kind of devolving into just another boxing story, just another underdog boxing story, very straightforward, very by the numbers. It, even as just a straightforward boxing story, it there's just not enough to keep me engaged. And it doesn't help that Joe is a really boring protagonist. He has nothing to lose. He has nothing to lose. He doesn't have that much to gain other than victory, which, duh, all boxers want to gain victory, otherwise why the would you box? So, yeah, he's kind of boring. He's one note. From the very first episode to the very last, Joe has no arc. He has no real, like, there's no stakes for him. You really just, the only real drive he seems to have is the fact that he starts out as a con boxer who fakes losses or whatever with his manager, his trainer, Nanbu, who is actually more interesting than Joe, which is kind of bizarre. He's actually more interesting than the protagonist, because at least he has something to lose and something going on. He's threatened by gangsters or whatever, but it's still kind of one note and predictable. It doesn't really, even that aspect of the story doesn't come back till the end, and it by that point there's just not much of a draw really. So yeah, Joe, he has nothing to lose. He doesn't have a girl that he's trying to impress, or people he's trying to help, or his only real underdog status is that he's from a poor junky place. But I mean, aren't all underdogs? I mean, is that enough? He's just kind of dull. So, other than trying to prove that he's a real boxer, and fighting without gear, even though the gear is the most interesting part of the show, and it quickly becomes it starts to feel more and more like a gimmick. The most interesting use of the gear I've actually seen, and this really shows just how misplaced the show's priorities feel, is when the main antagonist, the main boxer that Joe has to take out at the very end, the guy he's working his whole way towards, silver-haired man, he has to take off his gear because he wants to fight Joe fair and square. And apparently his gear is so attached, it's so a part of him that it's like giving up a drug or whatever. So it's like really hard and painful for him to deal with, and it's like, he goes through this whole withdrawal period before he fights Joe. And I'm like, okay, well that's kind of neat, but he's taking off the gear. Like, that's still... And not only that, but the fact that he even took off his gear in the final round really kind of drives home just how unimportant the gear is to this story, and B, how much even the underdog story is mishandled, because wouldn't it have been more satisfying for Joe to beat this guy with his super advanced gear? Like, why have the playing field leveled? That made the final match boring as hell. The whole show is building to this, and it's just a bore. Like, there's no real stakes at that point. If Joe loses, okay, he's not the victor. He's not number one. That's it. That's the stakes. That's your underdog. That's what he has to lose. Like, there's nothing. Even Nanbu being threatened by the gangsters, is resolved before the final match. So it's like, okay, well, all right. I guess he's just got to make his trainer proud. There's just nothing. So yeah, it has this kind of retro aesthetic, and I guess that's another hook. It's trying to look like a throwback anime from early 2000s or the 90s or whatever. But even that goes a little too far. Even the presentation looks a bit scratchy and low res, and even a bit ugly in some shots. Because they're trying to give it this old school aesthetic in an HD, standard, and it looks a bit forced. If I'm going to be completely honest, You know, we've seen plenty of modern anime that, are high res as fuck, look like modern anime, and can still look great. I appreciate the effort, but it's not necessary. You could look like a modern anime and still look good. You don't have to make it extra fuzzy and low res to, convince us that this is the real deal. Um, but of course, that wouldn't have been such a big deal if the story had engaged me. You know, Golden Kamui may look like shit, but it still has a well-written plot with interesting characters. This doesn't even have that. So, yeah, I just think Megalobox is, you know, less of an underdog story, more of a blunderdog story. It really squanders its potential, and the whole plot is just a straight line. So, if you want a straightforward boxing anime without the gear gimmick or whatever, just go watch Hajime no Ippo, which is a far better boxing show. It's a lot longer, but I mean, hell, it tells a bajillion better stories over the course of its run than this. In a single arc, Hajime no Ippo has more to offer than the entirety of Megalobox. So, yeah, it's kind of all style, no substance kind of case, I would say. Um, so I'm gonna have to put this on the shelf next to Darling in the Franxx for, um, shows that started off with a whole lot of style and kind of don't have the meat to back it up. So, you guys tell me what you think in the comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think the gears were well utilized in the story? Was it enough for you? Did you like the way it looked? Let me know. And that's all for now. I have a few more anime to review this season, but we're getting close to the end, so I'll see you guys next time with my next review. Peace.